The biting chill of the desert night still clung to the air as Nahela opened her eyes, the first faint hint of grey seeping into the eastern sky. Her wrists and ankles ached with a dull, constant throb, bound tightly by thick rawhide ropes to the rough, sun-baked rock formation that had been her prison since dusk. Despair, a cold and heavy stone, settled in her gut. She had been condemned, banished by her own people, the Apache, under accusations she swore were false. Left here to face the relentless sun, the scavenging coyotes, and the ultimate inevitable surrender to the vast, unforgiving emptiness that stretched endlessly around her. Each breath was a struggle against the tightening knot of fear in her chest, a silent scream against the injustice that had brought her to this desolate end. The quiet of the desert was immense, broken only by the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the imagined echoes of her tribe's retreat, leaving her to die. As the pre-dawn light began to paint the sky with streaks of bruised purple and pale orange, a faint sound, alien to the deep silence, stirred her. The distant thud of hooves, soft at first, then growing steadily louder, cut through the stillness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the backdrop of her impending doom. Was it them, returning to ensure her demise, or perhaps a different kind of predator drawn by the scent of desperation? Panic flared, hot and sharp, quickly followed by a strange, desperate hope. If it was a human, any human, there might be a chance, however slim, to plead, to beg, to bargain for a reprieve from the dawn's grim promise. She strained against her bonds, the raw hide biting deeper into her flesh, her gaze fixed on the approaching silhouette. The horse crested a small rise, silhouetted for a moment against the awakening sky, and then a man dismounted, his movements tired but deliberate. He was a cowboy, judging by his wide-brimmed hat, dust-coated duster, and the worn leather of his chaps. His face, when he turned towards her, was a canvas of weathered lines, a landscape of hard-earned cynicism. His eyes, though, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, surprise, perhaps, or a weary curiosity. He stopped a few yards away, studying her, his hand instinctively going to the Colt on his hip. Her plea was a ragged whisper, a desperate gasp that tore from her throat. "Save me, cowboy. Please. They banish me to die at dawn. I'll be yours forever. Just save me." The words were raw, untainted by pride, a pure expression of her will to survive. Ethan Vance, haunted by a past he couldn't outrun, had been drifting for weeks, seeking solace in the solitude of the desert. He'd seen enough suffering to turn a man's heart to stone, and yet, looking at the young Apache woman, bound and broken, a primal chord of decency stirred within him. Her eyes, wide with terror and a desperate plea, pierced through his hardened exterior. He'd witnessed the brutality of the frontier, the simmering hatreds between white settlers and native tribes, and knew that freeing her would be an act of profound risk. But something in her voice, in the sheer rawness of her plea, resonated with the forgotten parts of himself. With a sigh that carried the weight of his own weary soul, he holstered his weapon, pulled a knife from his belt, and began to approach her. The harsh glint of the blade, a stark contrast to the dawning hope in Nahela's eyes. The decision was made. He would cut her free, consequences be damned. The desert, though vast and seemingly empty, held countless hidden dangers, and Nahela knew them all. With her bonds severed, the initial rush of relief was quickly replaced by the stark reality of their situation. The sun was now a relentless eye in the sky, beating down on the barren landscape, turning the air into a shimmering furnace. Ethan, despite his act of liberation, remained an enigma. He was a white man, and Nahela had known little but animosity from his kind. His silence was unnerving, his gaze guarded, and she knew that this fragile truce, born of desperation, could shatter at any moment. They moved without a spoken word, a tense, unspoken agreement to navigate the brutal heat and scarce resources. Each step was a silent negotiation between their lingering suspicions and the overwhelming need for survival, an acknowledgement that they needed each other, at least for now. As the sun climbed higher, the desert intensified its assault. Mirages danced on the horizon, teasing with false promises of water, and the very air seemed to crackle with the heat. Nahela, though physically weakened, still possessed the inherent knowledge of her people. She noticed the subtle shifts in the sand, the faint scent of moisture carried on the wind, signs that Ethan, for all his frontier experience, seemed to miss. Their pace was slow, deliberate, conserving precious energy. Thirst became a gnawing companion, making every swallow a painful reminder of their predicament. Ethan's eyes constantly scanned the horizon, not just for water, but for any sign of movement, any hint of the tribe that might be pursuing Nahela, or other dangers lurking in the vastness. Late in the afternoon, Nahela, her throat raw and parched, gestured towards a cluster of stunted mesquite trees far in the distance, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Water," she rasped, the single word hoarse. Ethan, skeptical but desperate, followed her lead. The walk felt endless, each step a battle against exhaustion. When they finally reached the spot, hidden among the thorny branches and sun-baked rocks, they found a small, stagnant pool, barely a trickle, but it was enough. They knelt side by side, scooping the murky liquid into their cupped hands, the simple act of shared survival, a powerful, unspoken bond. The taste was earthy, metallic, but it was life. As they rested, sharing the last of Ethan's dried jerky, a quiet moment hung between them. Ethan, breaking the long silence, spoke in a low, gruff voice. "Why were you banished?" Nahela hesitated, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Lies," she finally whispered, her voice laced with a pain deeper than any physical wound. "A tribal elder. Jealousy." Her words were few, but the weight behind them was immense. Ethan simply nodded, his own past a heavy burden he rarely spoke of. In that shared silence, beneath the vast, indifferent sky, a faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The shared water, the shared struggle, and the dawning understanding of Nahela's plight had begun to chip away at the walls they had both built around themselves. A fragile truce had begun to deepen into something more akin to mutual reliance. Days bled into one another, a blur of relentless sun and stark landscapes. The desert, while no longer a direct threat to their immediate survival, remained an ever-present, watchful entity. They stumbled upon the skeletal remains of an abandoned mining camp, a ghost town frozen in time, its wooden shacks sagging and sun-bleached, whispering tales of forgotten dreams and dashed hopes. It offered a temporary, if unsettling, refuge from the elements and the unseen dangers that followed them. The air was thick with dust and the silence of abandonment, broken only by the mournful creak of a loose board or the rustle of a tumbleweed. This desolate place, a monument to human ambition and eventual failure, seemed to amplify the loneliness that clung to them both. Inside, the dilapidated confines of a former saloon, its windows shattered and floorboards groaning, the oppressive silence seemed to pull at Ethan's memories. He found himself staring into the dust-laden remnants of a broken mirror, seeing not just his own tired reflection, but fleeting, fractured images of a past he desperately tried to bury. A small farm, a woman with kind eyes, the innocent laughter of a child, then the sudden, terrifying chaos of a raid, the roar of gunfire and the searing agony of loss. A conflict with a band of renegade tribesmen had ripped his family from him, leaving him with a bitter emptiness that had since defined his existence. That pain, though years old, still festered, making him wary of anyone, especially anyone tied to the native world. Yet Nahela's vulnerability chipped away at his hardened resolve, forcing him to confront the complexities of his own prejudice. Nahela, sitting across from him, her back against a crumbling adobe wall, sensed his internal struggle. She watched him, her gaze quiet and perceptive. Through a mixture of gestures and the few English words she knew, she tried to convey more of her story. The false accusations had been orchestrated by an ambitious elder, a man who coveted her family's standing and sought to discredit her father. The banishment wasn't just about her. It was a power play, a cruel example to consolidate control. She described the shame, the profound betrayal of being cast out by her own blood, sentenced to a death that was meant to erase her very existence. The emotional weight of her narrative, stripped bare by the desolate setting, resonated deeply with Ethan's own experiences of loss and injustice, creating an unspoken bridge between them. Their fragile sanctuary was shattered by the distant sound of approaching riders, a faint but unmistakable thudding on the hard-packed earth. Ethan's head snapped up, his hand immediately on his pistol. "Riders," he murmured, his voice tight. Nahela's eyes widened in fear. It could only be the men sent by her tribe, or perhaps bounty hunters drawn by the possibility of a reward for her capture. There was no time to question, no time to hesitate. They moved quickly, instinctively, pressing themselves against the shadowy recesses of the saloon, holding their breaths, praying the wind would carry their scent away and that the crumbling walls would offer enough concealment. The suspense was a palpable thing. A taut cord stretched to its breaking point as the sounds of hooves grew louder, closer, threatening to extinguish their flicker of hope. The desert, once a silent accomplice to their flight, transformed into an active participant in their desperate game of cat and mouse. As the riders drew closer, Nahela instinctively took the lead, her deep knowledge of the land proving invaluable. She led them through a labyrinth of narrow canyons, their sheer rock faces providing temporary cover and confusing their pursuers. Her movements were fluid, graceful, a testament to years spent traversing this harsh wilderness. She pointed out faint trails only visible to a practiced eye, directed Ethan over precarious rockfalls, and urged their weary horses through dry riverbeds, leaving minimal tracks. Ethan, a skilled frontiersman in his own right, marveled at her innate connection to the land, a stark contrast to his own reliance on maps and instinct. This wasn't just survival, it was a finely tuned dance with the elements, one he was quickly learning to follow. The pursuit intensified, becoming a relentless, grinding chase. The sun continued its merciless assault, baking the canyons until the air shimmered and vision blurred. Ethan, with his tracker's eye, noticed subtle signs of their pursuers. A fresh hoofprint, a disturbed stone, the distant glint of metal. He used his experience to lay false trails, leading them through areas where the ground was too hard to leave clear marks, or diverting them into dense brush where their passage would be harder to discern. A sudden, unexpected rockslide thundered down a narrow pass behind them, a close call that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through both of them. It wasn't intentional, but it served as a brutal reminder of the wilderness's indifference and the constant, unpredictable dangers they faced. A tense silence often fell between them, broken only by the rhythmic thud of hooves and the harsh rasp of their own breathing. There was no time for idle chatter, only sharp, concise commands or urgent warnings. At one point, crossing a treacherous, fast-moving river, their horses struggled against the current. Nahela, seeing Ethan's horse falter, didn't hesitate. She reached out, grabbing his stirrup, pulling his struggling animal towards the shallower bank. It was a small act, but a profound one. A testament to the trust that was slowly but surely blossoming between them. Ethan, soaked and breathless, looked at her with a new appreciation. She wasn't just a burden he had chosen to carry. She was a fierce, capable ally, a force of nature in her own right. He found himself relying on her, something he hadn't done on anyone in years. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of orange and deep violet, they reached a secluded cave, hidden behind a curtain of scrub brush. It was a precarious refuge, but it offered momentary safety. The tension, however, remained a palpable presence. They could hear the distant echoes of hooves, growing fainter but still there, a constant reminder of the relentless hunters. Ethan cleaned his rifle, his movements practiced and efficient, while Nahela sharpened a small hunting knife she carried. Their eyes met across the flickering campfire, a shared understanding passing between them. They were two outcasts, bound by circumstance, fighting for their lives against a world that seemed determined to break them. But in that shared struggle, a quiet strength was building, a determination to outwit, outrun, and ultimately survive. Days later, battered but unbowed, Nahela and Ethan arrived at the dusty edges of Redemption Creek, a frontier town clinging precariously to existence amidst the vastness of the Arizona Territory. It was a collection of ramshackle wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, and a handful of homes, all baked under the unyielding sun. The air was thick with the scent of dust, stale beer, and the faint, sweet smell of horses. For them, it represented a desperate gamble, a place where they might find supplies, information, or perhaps a fleeting moment of respite. Yet, as they rode down the main street, the suspicious glances of the few inhabitants they encountered were a stark reminder of the deep-seated prejudices that permeated the frontier. A native woman and a white man traveling together was an unusual and often unwelcome sight. Ethan dismounted first, his hand subtly resting on his pistol, his eyes sweeping the street, assessing the quiet hostility. "Stay close," he muttered to Nahela, his voice low. He tried to project an air of nonchalant authority, attempting to pass them off as a traveling couple, a common enough sight in these parts. But the wary stares from the men gathered outside the saloon, their hands hovering near their own holsters, made it clear that their presence was unsettling. Nahela, though she understood little of the spoken words, felt the weight of their judgment, the suspicion that radiated from every corner of the town. Her instinct was to shrink away, to disappear, but the desperation for supplies, especially water and medical aid for a superficial wound on her arm, pushed her forward. Their luck, or perhaps fate, led them to the general store, a cramped building overflowing with barrels of nails, sacks of flour, and dusty jars of pickled goods. Behind the counter stood a woman, grizzled and sharp-eyed, her face a roadmap of hard living, but with a surprising warmth in her gaze. She was Ilara, a widow who had seen more than her fair share of hardship and understood the nuances of survival on the frontier. She recognized the weariness in Ethan's eyes and the desperate hope in Nahela's. Without fanfare, she offered them a basin of clean water, a rare commodity, and some rough bandages for Nahela's arm. It was a simple act of kindness, a quiet defiance of the town's unspoken prejudices, and it felt like a lifeline in their desperate journey. That evening, tucked away in the back of Ilara's small, cluttered home, they ate a meager but warm meal, beans and tough jerky. The silence was different here, not the oppressive quiet of the desert, but a gentle hum of domesticity. As Ilara mended some of Ethan's torn clothes, Nahela, slowly, hesitantly, began to share more of her story, using the few English words she knew and Ilara's sympathetic expressions to bridge the language barrier. She spoke of her family, of the false accusations orchestrated by a jealous rival elder, and the shame of her banishment. Ethan, listening intently, found his cynicism softening further, replaced by a deep sense of indignation. Ilara, her eyes filled with understanding, simply nodded. "The frontier," she murmured, her voice raspy. "It breeds good men and bad, but sometimes it brings together the most unlikely of souls." Her words were a balm, a momentary sanctuary in a world that had offered them little but hardship, solidifying the fragile bonds that were now forming between these three disparate individuals. Refreshed but still wary, Nahela and Ethan left Redemption Creek with renewed purpose, their supplies replenished and their resolve hardened. The path ahead led them towards the fringes of the Apache territory, a place Nahela both yearned for and feared. She knew the general vicinity of the elder who had betrayed her, a man named Hakan, and believed that if she could get close enough, she might find a way to expose his lies. The desert seemed to echo their determination, the vast landscape reflecting their own internal journey, a blend of hope and lurking danger. Ethan, now fully committed to Nahela's cause, constantly scanned their surroundings, not just for the pursuing tribal members, but for any sign that could help them unravel the truth of her banishment. His cynical detachment had given way to a quiet, fierce loyalty. Their breakthrough came unexpectedly. As they navigated a narrow, seldom-used pass known only to native hunters, they stumbled upon the remains of a small, abandoned camp. It was clear that someone had recently been there and hastily departed. Among the scattered debris, Nahela's sharp eyes spotted a small, intricately carved bone flute, one she recognized instantly. It belonged to Kian, a young warrior who had been a close friend of her family and had vehemently argued against her banishment, only to disappear mysteriously shortly after. Near the flute, partially buried by shifting sand, was a small, rolled-up piece of deerskin. With trembling hands, Nahela unrolled it. It was a crudely drawn map, marked with symbols she recognized as Hakan's personal sigils, pointing to a secluded ravine and detailing what looked like plans for a raid on a neighboring smaller tribe, an act that would undoubtedly bring conflict and potentially discredit Nahela's own family further. The discovery sent a jolt of understanding and rage through Nahela. The map was irrefutable evidence, not only of Hakan's treachery, but of his darker ambitions. Her banishment wasn't just a matter of jealousy, it was a calculated move to eliminate any opposition to his power grab, painting her as a traitor to divert suspicion from his true intentions. Ethan, examining the map, understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about Nahela's freedom. It was about exposing a dangerous man who threatened the fragile peace of the region. The map provided a tangible objective. They needed to reach that ravine, find more evidence, and find a way to expose Hakan to the other elders before his plans came to fruition. However, their focus on the discovery left them momentarily vulnerable. A sudden rustle of brush, the clatter of a dislodged stone, and then a guttural shout ripped through the air. Their pursuers, a small group of Hakan's most loyal enforcers, had found them. They emerged from the surrounding scrub, rifles raised, their faces grim and determined. The element of surprise was lost. Ethan quickly pushed Nahela behind a large boulder, drawing his revolver. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken by the cocking of hammers. The truth was now in their hands, but they had to survive long enough to reveal it. The final, decisive confrontation was upon them, a desperate battle not just for their lives, but for justice and the fragile future of Nahela's people. The sun dipped low, casting long, dramatic shadows across the rugged canyon rim, where Nahela and Ethan found themselves cornered. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of impending confrontation. Hakan, flanked by his two most loyal, imposing warriors, stood before them, his face a mask of cold triumph. "You cannot escape your fate, banished one," he sneered, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "The desert claims what the tribe rejects." But Nahela, no longer the terrified, chained woman, stood tall beside Ethan, her eyes blazing with a newfound courage fueled by justice. The truth, now a burning ember within her, gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. Ethan, his rifle leveled, didn't move. He knew that a direct firefight was a last resort, one they might not survive. Instead, he chose a different weapon, the truth. "Hakan!" he called out, his voice echoing across the canyon, firm and resonant. Your lies end here. We know of your treachery, your plans to betray your own people." As he spoke, Nahela, with a swift movement, produced the deerskin map, holding it aloft for Hakan's men to see. The two warriors with Hakan exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes flicking from the map to their leader, a flicker of doubt entering their stern expressions. This wasn't the simple banishment they had been told to enforce. This was something far more insidious. Hakan's face twisted in rage, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. He lunged forward, a knife appearing in his hand, desperate to silence Nahela and destroy the damning evidence. But Ethan was faster. With a practiced maneuver, he fired a warning shot that kicked up dust inches from Hakan's feet, stopping him cold. Then, in a clear, deliberate voice, Ethan explained what the map revealed. Hakan's planned raid on a neighboring tribe, a move that would bring disaster and suffering, carefully concealed behind Nahela's unjust banishment. Nahela, empowered by Ethan's unwavering support, spoke in her native tongue, her voice clear and strong, detailing the false accusations, the true motives, and appealing directly to the loyalty of the two warriors, who now looked uncertain. The two warriors, their loyalty to the tribe outweighing their fealty to Hakan, looked from the incriminating map to their furious elder, and then to Nahela, who now spoke with the conviction of truth. They slowly lowered their weapons, their faces grim. Hakan, realizing his deception was exposed, let out a frustrated growl, but he was isolated, his authority shattered. There was no grand battle, no torrent of bloodshed, but a quiet, powerful victory won by courage and the undeniable weight of the truth. Nahela's name was cleared, not with violence, but with clarity and the help of an unlikely ally. Her banishment was undone, and her path forward, though still challenging, was now her own to forge. Ethan, watching her, felt a quiet sense of redemption wash over him. He had found his purpose in defending the innocent, a healing balm for his own tormented past. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, two solitary figures, bound by an extraordinary journey, stood on the precipice of a new, uncertain but hopeful future, the vastness of the Old West stretching out before them, ready for the next chapter of their unwritten lives.